It's GameJam time again. It's the second GMTK GameJam I participate in. For the first one, I made a 3D game where you need to escape and die. This time I thought of the mistakes I made last time and was able to make a better game, which with a few improvements coming after the rating phase might actually be quite fun. But let me tell you how it all started. Also, it will probably not be right after the rating phase since I don't have much time right now. I still needed to eat when the jam already started, so I used the time thinking of an idea and started developing when 2 hours were already over. The theme of the jam was roles reversed, which could mean that you play Pong but you control the ball instead of the paddle, or that there is a platformer but you have to build the level. I decided to make a game similar to Survivor EO, where you fight against large quantities of enemies using guns and other weapons, upgrading them and fighting through as many waves as you can, but in my version you spawn the creatures instead of controlling the player. I started working on the game by implementing a very basic AI for the player. The player moves up by the amount of enemies below the player divided by the amount of enemies above the player. Same goes for horizontal movement. Then some additional calculations to keep the speed the same, regardless of the enemy amounts at each side. It was kinda working, had still some flaws because I didn't check the distance, but it was good enough for now. Instead of improving it, I made a shotgun for the player to defend himself. It's definitely not the most efficient way to implement a shotgun, but the fastest and easiest. Basically, I rotate a triangle around the player to check with collisions where the most enemies are, and then shoot in that direction. In addition, I give the player a handgun with more range and more damage, but no aerial damage. But then it was time to go to bed, because sleep is important and lets you work more efficiently. Starting the next day with a delicious breakfast and with the necessary features for the player done, I moved to the UI, where I put some elements allowing the actual player of the game, the user, spawn different enemy types and see which upgrades the player gets. I also made some placeholders for the 3 basic enemies: default, archer and tank. The player, remember you have to defeat the player, chooses the upgrades partially randomly and partially depending on the amount of enemies of each type. If most enemies are of type default, the upgrade can be lifesteal, movement speed, shotgun shooting speed, teleport, or experience multiplier, since these upgrades are good against great amounts but weak enemies. If instead the field is dominated by archers, the upgrades are either handgun damage or handgun shooting speed, or projectile protection, since the archers stay out of the shotgun range. The upgrades against tanks are knockback wave, shotgun shooting speed, and damage to allow one-shotting tanks at higher levels. 2 hours of coding without testing later, which usually is a bad idea, but surprisingly almost everything worked first try. The upgrades were working, the player got XP by killing the enemies and choose the best upgrades. At this point of time, the player mechanics were basically done, and I got an idea of how the finished game might be. I initially thought I overscoped, but at this point in time I got hope. The first day wasn't over yet and I have basic mechanics for the player done. It looks alright. Sometime later, I finished the default enemy, which had the ability to stab the player. They're finally stabbing. They're stabbing the player. Yes, okay, this took me way too long and I think I'll do some art now because I can't really focus on coding anymore for now. After that, I had only 20 minutes left until the first day was over. With regained motivation from this success, I moved on to the archer enemy. It first didn't work because I am used to 3D development and moved projectiles on the wrong axis, but some easy and not so easy fixes later, the archer was done, and also the tank. Also, I forgot to explain the numbers on the enemies in this and the following clips. They show how important the enemies are for the calculation of the direction the player should move. Further away means a smaller number means less important. This should allow the player to react quickly to new spawning enemies closer to him and prevent him from always moving the same direction once a certain amount of enemies are spawned in. Now, all of the basic mechanics for both the player and the enemies were done. The game was playable. Well, you couldn't win or lose, but that's not that important, I guess. I finally started working on better visuals. You stare at boring circles for long enough. I asked Rex what he wanted as creatures, and he wanted rocky golems with pteranodon heads. I liked the idea and started making it, but my art skill is not good enough for drawing that completely top down, so I would have to draw every creature 4 times, once for every direction. That's why I decided to make alien spaceships instead. It doesn't really matter how they look, as long as they look somewhat alright. I'd like to explain my thought behind the art, but all that's behind it is simple shapes, squares, hexagons, circles, and color gradients. That's all, except for the default. That is a spiky thingy because I thought it would look good, and I thought it might fit with the ability to punch. I kept the player art for later, since I had something special planned, which the time wasn't enough for, and started on the visuals for the background instead. I made a shader to fade out the grid texture to the edges of the screen where the player isn't. With that, it already looked quite interesting, but the UI was still terrible. That was about to be fixed next. I kept the irregular, hand-drawn style for all the UI elements. Boxes for the upgrades and enemy area, a slider for mana, level up progress and health. I also made icons for the slider handles to make the ending of the slider feel a little more interesting. I fixed the background grid and drew a background space map and made icons for all of the player power-ups. Another boost for the visuals for the game is post-processing. While the package was installing, I searched for some sounds since the time was really running out and there was still a lot missing. Post-processing later, I made it the last UI visuals. The costs, damage, experience gain, and health for the enemies. Since I didn't have the time to make it displayed on hover or to fade out as you move the cursor further away from the enemy placer, I needed to fit it all on a small area, which made the UI a little too complicated, but at least it looked somewhat alright, and that's important, especially for game jams, I think. At that point, there were less than 5 hours remaining. I wrote a final to-do list in Notion, and I actually got almost everything from it done before the jam ended. I made a menu, a very basic how to play. All the sounds, there were only 10 or something, and I just edited existing ones I found on freesound.org, and reused the music player for the music and ambient sounds from another project. With that done, I was at the last 3 hours of the jam. I still needed to make the player, so I quickly got to that feature. Initially, I wanted to make the player a simple spaceship, which always gets some texture upgrades when it upgrades by killing enemies. The time was too short for that, so sadly I just drew one simple texture, and that's the player. 2 hours were left. I implemented a 5-minute timer to give the player the possibility to lose. Asked on the GMTK Discord server for a name for my game. Someone came up with Rovivrus or Rovivrus, I don't know how I should pronounce it, since that's Survivor inverted, and I quite liked it. With the last features done, I built the game, submitted it to the GMTK jam, shared the link with some friends for some quick playtesting, and made some more art for itch.io to make my page look more appealing. My game was submitted, I had all the necessary features implemented, and almost 1 hour left to upload a new version. The submission period was extended by 1 hour because this game jam was almost a bit too much for the itch.io servers, and it was quite laggy. About 5 minutes before the extended submission period ends, one of my playtesters discovered the bug. Only the default enemy gave XP to the player. I started Unity 2 minutes less remaining. I exported the game, another 2 minutes passed, and uploaded it to itch.io. With literally 32 seconds left of the extended period, the fixed game was uploaded. Well, partially, since the browser version doesn't have the fix. With that, the game was done. A complete, well, partially complete game made in 48 hours. I guess I spent almost 30 hours developing during this period, which is usually the amount I do in 1 to 3 weeks, since I don't have much time for a game dev usually. I think it turned out alright. Remember, you can play the game on badpaddy.itch.io/Rovivrus, and let me know what you like about the game or this video, what you don't like, or what I could improve. Also, I will probably make another video about this game once the results are in, showing the results and implementing the missing features, such as the ability to drag placed enemies around, a lot of balancing, maybe improve textures for the player, a tutorial. Well, anyway, I see you in the next video, which will be in either 1 to 3 weeks from now, or in the end of August or start of September. And yeah, bye, see you next time. Also, you can win the game by just placing one archer and waiting some time, or 2 archers.